Hello, here we are on slide 5. Um, so, all the Italian Renaissance theater I've talked about so far was for a limited audience. Plays were written by court appointed poets for aristocratic audiences. So, everything we've talked about so far, definitely for the upper class. The development of a public professional theater in Italy was to come from mostly another source, which was Commedia dell'arte. If you haven't heard of this ever, um, you will continue. I promise it's something that always comes up in the study of theater. It's a very interesting art form. Um, Commedia dell'arte translates to comedy of professional players. And it most likely came to be between 1545 and 1570. Before 1600, it had spread throughout Europe, um, and it lasted there as a form of really popular entertainment until the 18th century. Performers today still study commedia dell'arte tactics as just like a study of physical comedy because that's what it really was. Um, so there are two fundamental characteristics of commedia dell'arte. It was improvisation and stock characters. So let's dive into improvisation first. Commedia dell'arte actors did not work from a script. They worked from a plot outline only. And then based on that kind of loose plot outline, the actors would perform and they would improvise their dialogue and their action. Each player in a Commedia dell'arte troupe always played the same character with its own like fixed attributes and costumes. And because of this, there may have been some repetition of lines or stage business. For instance, if they performed their improvised performance based on their plot outline for an audience and certain things, certain lines that they delivered were really like well received by the audience, they would probably chat about that later and say, oh, we should keep that, we should keep that. And so over time, the plays might have been like a little less improvised because they may have been trying to like repeat the bits that really got a good reaction from the audience. Um, and also each scene in a Commedia dell'arte piece was always closed by rhyming couplets, so a pair of rhyming lines. So these were most likely scripted and memorized because it would be harder to just improvise a rhyming couplet off the top of your head. But no actor could ever be sure definitely what others would say or do next. So there was certainly a level of spontaneity. And yes, Commedia dell'arte was always comedy. So that's how the improvisation aspect works. The other fundamental characteristic of Commedia dell'arte is stock characters, meaning they always used the same characters. Every Commedia dell'arte troupe had their own take on things, but there were the same character types that were repeated from one troupe to another. So I want to go over the character types with you now. These types can be divided into two categories: unmasked characters and masked characters. So the unmasked characters, the ones who did not wear masks, were typically the young lovers. They usually served as this sort of like sort of like a normal person, quote unquote, that the masked characters were like set up against, because the masked characters were usually a little bit more peculiar. And so the unmasked characters were kind of like the straight man to the more comedic masked characters. These young lover characters were typically depicted as witty and handsome and well educated, but sometimes they could also be characterized as sort of naive, and maybe not too bright despite all their education. Um, each company, each troupe of commedia performers had usually one or two pairs of lovers, of the people who would perform the lover roles. And then the masked characters. The masked characters were either masters or servants. The masters, there was this stock character called Capitano. He was a braggart and also a coward. So he bragged about all his powers in battle and in love, but he usually eventually was discredited in both. Like he really wasn't that strong in battle, and he really wasn't that great of a lover. One of the other masters characters is Pantalone. He was middle aged. He was always a middle aged or elderly merchant, and also Dottore, the doctor, who was usually Pantalone's friend. Sorry, let me just adjust this for a minute. Um, so Dottore was usually Pantalone's friend, and he held an established place in society. He was usually a doctor of law or medicine, and he was often portrayed as a jealous husband in these improvised pieces. And then the servant characters were all different types of Zani characters, Zanni. Um, Most scripts required at least 2 or 3 of these characters. Usually one of the Zani or servant characters was clever and one was stupid. The servant characters always kept the plots moving as they sought to help or thwart their master's efforts in things. Most were male, but some were female. The famous Zani or servant roles were Harlequin, who was like a clownish servant. But that Harlequin was by far the most popular of the Zani roles. And there was also Brighella, who was a very witty servant, a very smart servant. Commedia dell'arte troops averaged 10 to 12 members, 7 to 8 men, and 3 to 4 women. So we have women performing now in the Renaissance in Italy. A typical troupe included 2 sets of lovers, a servant girl, a capitano, 2 Zani, and 2 old men, Pantalone and Dottore. It was very vigorous between 1570 and 1650, but it continued to be performed until about 1775. And it was always the most popular in Italy, but Commedia did make its way to France and Spain during the Renaissance. We'll actually see when we get to our study of the French Renaissance, we'll see how the Commedia dell'arte influenced one of the playwrights we're going to study, Molière, who wrote some great comedies. Okay, so on the next slide, I have included a video made by the National Theatre Company. You're going to see, it's about a 9-minute video. You've got to watch it. It's going to completely shape your understanding of what Commedia dell'arte was all about. You see really, really good examples of all these stock characters and their masks. And basically in the video, you watch acting students learning how to perfect this commedia form and how to perform these types of stock characters and how physical it was in terms of comedy, physical comedy. So you got to check it out. It's on the next slide. You're going to delve even further into Commedia dell'arte for this week's discussion board. So definitely watch the video on the next slide because it'll give you a solid understanding of what Commedia was all about. And then you'll be able to use that understanding in this week's discussion board. So I'm going to say bye-bye for now. Go watch the video on the next slide and then participate in this week's discussion board and make sure you've got all your notes taken for this lecture on the note-taking form for the Italian Renaissance that I posted on Blackboard. All of your note-taking forms are going to come in real handy when it's time to work on your final project for this course, which is really coming up pretty soon. So please make sure that all your note-taking forms are complete and accurate. And if you ever have questions, just let me know. I'm here to help. And yeah, do the discussion board. Make sure your notes are all set. And then you have to get started on your Renaissance research project. You got to do an outline for me and submit it to me this week at some point. All right. I will see you next time. Bye.